Hello and welcome to your Chapter 15 video lecture series where we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. We'll start off with section 15.1 to discuss the comparison of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. First, let's review our somatic nervous system. This is going to be the nervous system that helps us consciously perceive and control processes. We have our somatic sensory portion that's going to detect signals from our special senses. This would include things like our vision, hearing, equilibrium or balance, our smell, and our taste. And we are bringing that information in from our skin and our proprioceptors. And then our somatic motor division or portion is going to send signals from our central nervous system over to our skeletal muscles. So naturally, this would incorporate our voluntary movements in our cerebrum and our reflexive movements, which is going to involve our brainstem and our spinal cord. So notice in this figure here, we have that sensory information moving in through the posterior root and into that posterior horn of the gray matter of our spinal cord. And then our motor neuron here has its cell body in the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, exits out the anterior root through that spinal nerve and eventually to its destination at this skeletal muscle. Now let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. You've just been introduced to a couple elements regarding this nervous system, but of course in this chapter we're diving into detail. So we also are going to call this the autonomic motor or visceral motor system, and the processes are regulated below conscious level. We'll transmit signals from our central nervous system to organs or tissues such as the heart, smooth muscle, and our glands. And I want you to think of this as muscle and glands, right? So you're going to think cardiac and smooth muscles and glands. And it'll respond to visceral sensory input. So here we see some sensory input from our lungs. That sensory neuron is moving up through some structures we haven't learned just yet, but will in a few slides. And then through that spinal nerve and through the dorsal root into our spinal cord. And these sensory neurons are not considered a part of the autonomic nervous system. It is going to have motor neurons as a part of its system, and we're going to dive into that detail soon. But first we need to mention that our autonomic nervous system is functioning in order to maintain homeostasis, keeping conditions inside our body within optimal ranges. So just to complete an explanation of this figure, we see two motor neurons for our autonomic nervous system. We have our preganglionic neuron that is sending a motor nerve impulse through it to what's known as a ganglionic neuron. It's going to synapse with its second motor neuron here, and this ganglionic neuron is going to transmit that signal down to the smooth muscles within the bronchioles of the lung here. But of course, we're going to see some motor transmission over to maybe some cardiac muscle or to some glands throughout the autonomic nervous system. Let's take a closer look at what that last motor neuron or lower motor neuron is doing for our somatic nervous system versus the motor neurons in our autonomic nervous system. So again, our somatic nervous system is under voluntary control and goes over to our skeletal muscle. So here, if we're looking at our spinal cord, we're seeing our lower motor neuron cell body in the ventral horn of our gray matter in the spinal cord. And that single lower motor neuron is going to extend out this ventral root through the mixed spinal nerve, and then will course through a myelinated axon with a larger diameter over to its target organ, which is the skeletal muscle. And here we're going to release acetylcholine from the synaptic knob, and that'll move through the synaptic cleft over to the motor end plate here on the skeletal muscle in order to excite it. Now let's take a look at the lower motor neuron of our autonomic nervous system. Like I said before, we're going to have two motor neurons here in order to convey the response that we want. That first neuron is called a preganglionic neuron. The cell body is going to be within the brainstem, or as pictured here, within the spinal cord. We see a thin myelinated axon that projects to a autonomic ganglion, which is this round structure over here. And just to review, a ganglion is going to be a collection of cell bodies within our peripheral nervous system, right? So here that preganglionic neuron is going to terminate and release acetylcholine over to the second motor neuron. So you could see here that these neurotransmitters are moving over to, in this illustration, nicotinic receptors, and that is going to excite this postganglionic axon, or sometimes it's called the ganglionic neuron, which will head over to its target organ. So here's more information on that second neuron. The cell body is found within the autonomic ganglion here. And you can notice that this neuron is unmyelinated. So you could see the myelin sheaths here on this preganglionic neuron, whereas here on the postganglionic neuron, it is no longer there. And it'll extend over to project its signal to either cardiac muscle, in this case, smooth muscle within the intestines, or a gland. And it can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine from its synaptic knob, and this can either lead to excitation or inhibition of the effector. It has the effector here is going to have a variety of receptor types, so depending on what receptor is there and what neurotransmitter is binding to it, we will have either excitation or inhibition. So you may be wondering, why does the autonomic nervous system have two motor neurons? Why not just have one motor neuron the way the somatic nervous system is set up? And the reason is because we have these two different circuits that are going to be more helpful in conveying the effect or the result that we want from our autonomic nervous system. So first we have neuronal convergence, and this is when we're going to have multiple preganglionic neurons to synapse onto one ganglionic neuron to continue the signal. The other scenario or circuit is going to be a neuronal divergence, and this is going to allow for branches of the preganglionic neuron to synapse to numerous postganglionic neurons or ganglionic neurons to continue that signal. And let's talk about our central nervous system's control of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to be regulated by our brain and the spinal cord. The hypothalamus is going to be a large player here. It's going to contain a lot of nuclei that is going to control both divisions of our autonomic nervous system, meaning the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. It's also essential for emotional ANS processes such as our flight or fight. And it can be influenced by areas of our cortex, the thalamus, and limbic system. Next, we have to talk about the influence of our brainstem here. We're going to have lots of nuclei throughout here that are going to mediate any visceral reflexes. So an example of this would be maintaining our blood pressure. And lastly, our spinal cord is going to help to govern some of our ANS reflexes. So we talk about the ANS reflexes in the very last section of this chapter, but some examples of those reflexes would be defecation, urination, which would be controlled by our parasympathetic nervous system.